When you try and come up with the idea for your own personal artistic project, your independent game, your comic book, your story, the world that you're building, it can be a real challenge to pick the right one. And actually, these days, as artists, we're often trained to come up with a huge variety of different ideas. If you look at the scale of different creatures, characters, worlds, and fantastical things that are created by concept artists and artists for the modern video game, the modern film, even for comics, there's a huge variety of creativity out there. It feels like we have kind of almost peaked in terms of being able to come up with crazy, interesting monsters and creatures and horrific things. But often the reality is that a good idea and a good project is simple. That for our own personal projects, what we actually might need to do is get a lot simpler. And instead of creating a million crazy ideas, just pick one good one and go really, really deep with it. Welcome to the Visual Scholar Podcast. My name's Tim Mcburnie. I have been a professional working artist for over 20 years. And on this show, we're all about demystifying the worlds of art, creativity, and productivity so that you can get better faster and enjoy your artistic journey. Check out my free brainstorming toolkit. If you want to take your art to the next level and really improve your skills, one of the best ways is to create your own personal artistic project. And to do that, you need a great idea. An idea that you're passionate about, that is unique and original to you, that is going to allow you to see this project through. I've taken the same tools and frameworks that I use every day and created a workshop on world building, ideation, and brainstorming. In it, you'll learn things like how to quiet the editing mind, how to enhance your blue sky brainstorming ability, and how to use brainstorming anchors for things like story or even your pre-existing ideas and proclivities as an artist. This is a free training. I think you're really going to enjoy it. So if that is something you're interested in, go check it out. The link will be in the description. So the reason that I think this is an important idea is that what I notice when a lot of us go to create that personal project and really figure out like, okay, I am going to plant a flag and really say, this is what I'm about as an artist, we often come up with something that is really high energy. It's got a lot of stuff to it. Often our strengths as artists are coming up with fantastical designs, fantastical ideas, worlds, scenarios. And I think often we feel as if when it's our turn to finally come up with our own fantastical world, our fantasy, science fiction extravaganza, that this is the time to kind of pack everything in the kitchen sink into it. Now, the problem with this is that I think if we look at the history and the practicality of this, and also I think if you look at some of the anatomy of what a good idea often is that this can actually be a major detriment to us building a clear signal, a clear idea that's easily transmissible and that people are going to pay attention to. And I think that often what happens is we put a huge amount of creativity into our projects. And in fact, it actually just kind of ends up as noise. This is probably something I have certainly fallen afoul of over the years. And I think that it takes a lot of, I guess, discipline to really pull back on a lot of those ideas and pick just one that I think is worth going deeper on. And there's just a whole bunch of reasons why I think this is a really important skill to have, because often when it comes to creating a good, clear signal with your idea, something that people can share, something that people can talk about with each other, it's often about picking something really simple. And I think often when we look at different ideas, when it comes to our own comics, our own world building, we often just, as I said, we try and create the most crazy dynamic creatures. And we're often trained to do this as concept artists or comic book artists or people who are working in visual development to kind of come up with the craziest ideas. This is kind of the muscle we build. But the reality is that often we're employed on those projects to create the most interesting things. Because if you think about the way that as artists, we're often employed as a service for a larger project. Again, it could be a film, an animation, a video game, whatever it is. We often get pulled in to design the most interesting aspects because the other aspects can just kind of be pulled from the world. If you're working on a science fiction movie, most of the sets and most of the environment is probably just fairly standard everyday stuff. We get hired to create the monster. And so that's often what we do. And then when we go to create our world, we're like, well, mine's just going to be full of the best monsters. And if it's full of the best monsters, it kind of doesn't have one monster. It doesn't have a Ridley Scott / HR Geiger alien that you remember. It kind of has a million different aliens that no one remembers. And I think so much of creating really interesting things is having the discipline to understand that creative process. And really, instead of creating a million great ideas, just pick the best one or any one and go a lot deeper into it. Because I think that's often where we're going to find a lot of the magic really happen. So before we dive in too much to some good examples of this and how we may relate these ideas to our own creative lives and the projects we're making, let's first just tackle the first principles of this. Why is this so important? Like, why is it important to have one idea that's clear as opposed to a whole bunch of different cool stuff? And like, there are certainly exceptions to this rule, right? Like Souls-like games do have a million interesting creatures and monster designs. That's kind of how we experience that world. That's how you constantly get surprised and see new designs, new enemy patterns. You kind of learn and explore and evolve. And it's kind of important that every monster there is sort of very interesting. But this is often at the crux of the problem, is that as artists, we are often hired for those projects, and often the skills that we create are to make everything kind of interesting, and we're often thinking about making everything really iconic and to just turn up the volume on everything. And one of the things that's important to understand is we can see the need for clarity manifest in a lot of different industries. You can see the idea of an elevator pitch being really important in a lot of film and narrative design. And often when we are creating our own little projects, I think the clarity becomes much, much more important. The real problem with having a huge variety of different ideas like these monsters is that we are often not putting together the entire picture. We get hired to create the most interesting things. We get hired to create the most interesting monsters and futuristic designs and things that actually need a lot of artistic input or style or creativity to them. And we often don't get trained to really think about what is the core of this product. Like, what's the core of this intellectual property or world that you're building? How's that actually going to be turned into a comic or a story or whatever it is you're making? Often we get a little bit blindsided by that. And as we'll look at with some of the examples, you often also find that there is this restraint that is often placed on artists where we are often held back, and we do think like, hey, now that I'm going to create my thing, I'm just going to create this perfect canvas for unfettered creativity. And I'm just going to make everything as weird and as crazy and as wonderful as possible. And again, there's a lot of power to that. The problem is often it doesn't land that well. We don't really create a strong signal and a strong idea. And I think a good way to think about what we often may want to create, if you really want to invest a huge amount of your time into one of these projects, it's going to take a huge amount of your energy to actually follow through. It's easy to kind of start a million of these projects and not really end up anywhere. But if you're really going to follow through, it's going to be years of your life, at least. You do want people to kind of care about it, for you to be able to tell people about it and that they're sort of interested and that it's something that you can actually share with the world in some way, shape, or form. Unless it's just art therapy, we do want to create something that has a bit of that sort of virality to it. That is an idea that is going to raise to that level of being a bit like a meme, where people just understand it through looking at it and engaging with it. And a lot of this comes down to some of the stuff I've been talking about recently on the channel, the concept of creating clear signal. Now, I'm talking about that in the past relating to a clear artistic voice, a unique voice that you develop as an artist, and the importance of repetition and clarity of that signal, as opposed to us artists just, which is often what we do, is we kind of mess around, experiment, and play around. And similar to having a million monsters, in that instance, no one really knows who we are. No one knows which monster to pay attention to. Instead of sort of Monster Hunter, probably we want a little bit more like H.R. Giger or Ridley Scott's Alien. We want something that is clear, iconic, and easy for people to understand. Now, the concept of signal that I've been talking about as part of the impact framework is really there to sort of serve artists and their identity, but you can see this basic idea of marketing and branding, I think, carries through pretty much everything. And it's something that is so important to pay attention to, because when you take on the role of creating your own project, again, we're no longer a cog in the machine. We are no longer just one part where often our job is to create the most interesting things. We're there to create that core message of what this project is. And one of the things you can see if you go back to looking at the elevator pitch of Hollywood is that understanding the core of a project and what it's about is something that's really important. Now, if you look at the elevator pitch, it is often referred to as a hook line is part of an elevator pitch. You often have my movie is this movie meets this movie. Really, this is a matter of, the elevator pitch metaphor is that you step into an elevator with someone who could potentially green light or just throw money at you if only they knew what your idea was about, and you do have a great idea and it's the best idea. It's an amazing idea. It's just that you need to communicate it to the right person. And you do step into an elevator, the right person is there, and you have like 20 seconds to pitch them on your idea. And if you can get it good enough, then that can change your life. Like that is, I guess, at the core of the elevator pitch. I guess the flip side of that is also that people in Hollywood and production circles don't have a lot of time, and most pitches they get are not very good. So kind of if you can't communicate it really quickly, there's really no point in talking to these people. So we kind of deal in this compressed hook, line, elevator pitch. This is X meets Y kind of version of projects. But what I kind of found by the more I interact with people who are actually closer to those circles and really understand how that functions is that is actually really important. And you definitely won't get anything made, or no one will really even talk to you or listen to your idea if you can't easily articulate what the core of that idea is, and to do so in a way where like someone would genuinely do a double take and be like, oh, that sounds interesting. Like, I wonder what that would actually be. And a lot of really high concept or interesting ideas for movies, video games, etc., they kind of need something like that. Otherwise, you kind of can't write an article about it. You can't share it with anyone. It's kind of really hard to even get it off the ground because it just doesn't have any traction. And if it doesn't have any traction there at the pitch meeting, it's probably not going to have any traction with an audience. Because if you can't get one person to understand it, how are you going to get an audience to understand it? How are you going to get people to buy the game or review the game or pay attention to the game or watch your movie or animation or read your comic or whatever it is? So there's a lot of wisdom there. But as artists, I feel like we often get a bit separated to it. From it. Now, a good way to kind of, I guess, explain how this might function is, and I've spoken about this previously on the channel, if you look at a classic example like Star Wars: A New Hope, again, a good way I like to explain that is that this is fundamentally about how humanity deals with technology and how especially the protagonist, Luke Skywalker, who embodies humanity, how he relates to that technological future and what role his faith and humanity plays in that story. And you have all these manifestations of this technological future that lacks humanity. You have the Death Star, which is this giant ball of technology that is literally just designed to destroy planets. The embodiment of what it means to be human, right? The living on Earth, right? And you also have Darth Vader, who embodies the literal taking over of humanity by technology. And in the middle of this is Luke Skywalker, who represents our point of view to a certain degree. And he has to navigate that and understand what role his faith, i.e., the Force, has in that story and whether there's any power there and who to trust. Do you trust technology and the targeting system, or do you trust yourself? That's what that story is about. And you can see that that's manifested in a huge amount of the conversations and scenes that happen within that story. Again, I have no idea whether that's what George Lucas had in mind. These things often are carried subconsciously and consciously at the same time. But and there's interpretation that's possible in a good story because it often is talking to something very sort of deep down. But I guess that's something that as a creator, at least you need to have a good understanding of what your story is about. And you need to be able to easily articulate it because every choice you make will relate back to this core idea. So having a clear signal is really important. Having something that is in the realm of being viral, being a meme, being something that's easy to share, easy to understand is really critical. Having something that just through hearing the idea, someone would want to see it is immensely valuable. And even though often I feel like the trap we fall into is we feel like, look, my artistry, my creativity is going to rise above all of that, all of that sort of marketing speak and money and sort of evil capitalism. But the reality is, there's nothing more depressing than working on one of these projects for like 3 or 4 years and then no one cares about it because you haven't really thought about what it is and you can't communicate it to anyone. So the bottom line is that more is often far less in these instances, is that if you confuse, you lose. What we're after is something that is genuinely interesting, is genuinely new, is exciting, but also something that relates to the human condition. Now, one of these little stories that I think is a great example of this, and this may go off on a bit of a rabbit hole because it kind of contains a couple of other interesting little side points. But one of the stories that I heard really early on was a lot of the tension between Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And I'll just go over some of the basics here because most people probably have no idea what I'm talking about in terms of Stan Lee versus Jack Kirby. But Stan Lee was one of the prime people behind the Marvel universe through the creation of Marvel, the publishing, the comics. If you don't know about that, again, he was just the face of Marvel Comics. And a lot of the artists that work with him kind of were maybe not quite so happy with the way that he took credit for the creation of a lot of those comics when famously people who created Spider-Man like Steve Ditko and people like Jack Kirby who created things like Thor, the Hulk, I think, and Fantastic Four, the way that often they actually created most of the visual designs are the things that we kind of pay attention to, and people are now getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in the Marvel Cinematic Universe to build variations of those old costumes upon, and that a lot of people were kind of really jaded by that experience. And as an artist, I really sided with these artists. And I think one of the things I didn't understand is just the value, though, of being able to harness a lot of that creative energy and come up with that sort of core idea and how that is often the difference between something succeeding and not. And I think that's just something that Stan Lee was very good at. He was very good at coming up with these key ideas, your Spider-Man, X-Men, Fantastic Four, these kind of really simple, basic ideas that people were able to kind of grab onto. And what you saw with a lot of the artists that really did most of the work is that sometimes they kind of lacked the clarity and the ability to focus their energy. So in the beginning, I was very frustrated by this, and I was really on the sort of Jack Kirby side. And I think there's certainly a lot of dodgy stuff that happened from the artist's perspective and artist rights and people stealing originals. And a lot of those artists who built most of the Marvel Cinematic Universe back in the day kind of not their estates and them often kind of dying in poor financial situations because they didn't really get to enjoy the fruits of their labor when it came to creating those ideas. So there's a lot of tension there, right? We can see that as setting the stage is that fundamentally we have Stan Lee, who was often just coming up with the pitch. He was the idea guy, but he wouldn't really do it. The execution was not really that important. to him, and often other people were writing and drawing and basically doing everything. And yet he took all the credit. And I think what you can see here is that there's always this kind of tension, but there is a huge amount of value to being able to channel all that creative energy from those crazy artists who are able to do all this fancy stuff and really direct it towards some of these ideas, something that is more shareable, easily understood, something that's viral, something that has impact. And that this is often what is behind the actual success of this. Now, I guess the real key interesting thing here is that we do have good examples of like Jack Kirby parting ways with that sort of Marvel side of things and actually going to the rival publisher DC and creating a whole bunch of cool stuff there. But none of it really had the impact, or has certainly lasted for as long as the stuff that he created with Stan Lee. And I guess this speaks to the way that often we're not quite trained as creatives to rein in that brainstorming rush of ideas, like the fire hose of ideas, and that often if it is just a whole bunch of crazy, interesting things, which I think a lot of Jack Kirby stuff was, a lot of the more psychedelic aspects of Asgard in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all the different kind of crazy technological things, is just pure Jack Kirby, right? It's just pure creative energy. But the reality is, in order to harness that, you do need to have this editing mind to your ideas, because not every one of those crazy creatures or designs or superheroes or environments was actually as interesting as those cool ones that someone like Stan Lee was able to kind of create. And I think you do need to really have both of these things to create really strong projects. And it's often people who are able to marry the creativity and the energy and the artistry with those high concept ideas, with that sort of Hollywood directorial ability to really get to the core of what your movie is about and to be able to easily articulate it very quickly and smoothly. And that often you need to keep that in mind in order for these projects not to get lost and not to just keep adding stuff to it, right? Because when it comes to something that is a meme or something that has a lot of impact and clarity, you want a small attack surface, right? You want a small area of impact so you can create a lot more sort of force and impact from that, right? So it has a lot more power. And I think our tendency as artists, especially when we're world building, is to kind of throw everything in the kitchen sink at this, to be like, I'm creating my own world and I'm going to create a whole bunch of stuff. And that often what you find is that all those ideas are good. But what's better is if you just kind of pick one that's really good and go deeper, because often what really would define a good idea, something worth putting 4 of your years into, right? Like a huge amount of your time, maybe over the long term, is that, as I said, like there's nothing worse than spending that amount of time on something and it just kind of going nowhere. It kind of just petering out, or you finally saying, hey, here's all my cool ideas, and no one can even understand what they are. It's not even that people say they don't like it. They just kind of, eyes just kind of glaze over, right? I've had that kind of stuff happen quite a bit where I'm working on something, I think it's really interesting, and it just kind of falls a bit flat. It's just like no one's that interested. It's really hard to get it across. And I find like when that's happened, if I look back at it, it is because I kind of really lacked clarity, and I was probably not thinking about this enough from the pitch point of view, the commercial point of view. And I think, again, if you really want to find some success doing this, there's a good alignment, I think, with the capitalistic, and we sort of touched on this, but I think it's so important to understand that there is actually a really good alignment with the capitalistic, with the production, the money side of this, and what we're actually after as artists, which is to make other people feel things, to create something that has an audience, that we're able to share our ideas with the world. And I think that ultimately, this is what we're trying to do. If you think about the power of what George Lucas did with Star Wars, where he had this vision of the future, where your faith in your own humanity mattered, right? That like despite this dystopian future, and you can imagine like Star Wars kind of doesn't make much sense, right? It's got people fighting with light swords, but even though there's guns and there's all these other more powerful weapons, it's kind of just for fun. It's a space opera. But underneath it is this really interesting message, I think anyway, that did actually make a big difference because so many people saw that movie and it gave them hope in their own humanity and their own faith in themselves against this kind of avalanche of technology that was coming and certainly did come and develop. And I think we can probably still have faith in that kind of system. And I think it's often these core ideas that are at the bottom of a project that really do make a difference. And that's kind of what we want, is to have how we feel about a particular subject as an artist to be manifested through our work and for other people to pick up on that and understand us and understand their own journey as well. So I think there's actually really good alignment often between these different worlds of the editorial world, where we do kind of make that function and you are kind of working on your project and you do pick one of these things and it actually kind of lands, because there's nothing worse than kind of sitting there and spending a whole bunch of time on it and then it just kind of goes nowhere and no one's interested. So I think if you can really build a good skill set here, like one of these directors, where you're able to articulate what your project is, you have the technical ability also to do it. It doesn't have to be some fantastical world. There's a huge variety of coming of age stories that have real meaning to people, that people have made as comics, movies, animations, and they are incredibly important. And as you can see, you can take a science fiction story that makes no sense, like something like Star Wars, and give it a huge amount of meaning. The real thing that matters is how this idea relates to people. Some people like to get this in a container of science fiction or fantasy or video games or whatever, but if there's not meaning at the core, then often it really doesn't matter because no one can understand what you're saying in the first place. Now, the way that I guess we need to develop these skills is, I think, to worry less about coming up with a million crazy ideas. Again, using that metaphor of a monsters is really good. If you have a million crazy monster designs, a million crazy interesting character designs, like that's good. That can be really important. But if there's not one there that you can go a lot deeper on, if you can't really unpack one of those key ideas about your science fiction or fantasy world and why it matters and why it relates to someone who's watching it, and how that interesting thing that you've created is going to change the way that people experience their lives. If you can't go deeper with that and connect it to some person's humanity, the struggles that they're going through, and the way that that may be interesting. And again, this could be from any aspect. It could be like gameplay mechanic. It could be, again, high-level concept pitch. It could be whatever it is. If you can't really relate that back to some interesting thing that is actually going to communicate with people and give them something interesting to play with, there's just no point in even beginning. So the editing aspect here, I've gone through a big journey myself, really kind of coming to terms with this, but where I land after thinking about this and working on projects that sort of no one cares about and working on projects that seem to land better and sort of working on a whole bunch of different stuff, is that ultimately you do want to have one of these ideas that really does align a little bit more with the editor's mindset, with the publisher's mindset, with the elevator pitch, the hook line, because there's a huge amount of wisdom there where really this is connecting to what we actually want to do as artists. And ultimately, editors and the editing skills that we can build in ourselves are what are able to channel that creative fire hose that we often have and really put it to good use. And I think if you can master these skills, and they're all just skills you can build, it just opens up so many more possibilities. So a lot of this leads me to this last point that I think is just briefly worth mentioning, that ultimately this is underpinning and aligning perfectly with the idea that creativity is inspired and enhanced by constraint and restriction. That the problem is, though, we often feel as if you are working on a project or you're experiencing some sense where someone's editing you and they're directing your creative energy and they're kind of saying, like, hey, no, don't do all that, just do this. It feels as if someone's stopping you from coming up with the best ideas. And often we joke about this as concept artists or people who are in visual development, people who are coming up with ideas, is that, you kind of pitch some crazy high concept thing and it often gets sort of pushed back because people want the average version, right? If you sort of give people a little spectrum of interesting things to pick from, on one end, it's the most crazy idea for a particular thing. On the other end, it's basically the most generic, and they're probably going to pick something in the middle. It always feels as if there's restraint there. But I think the reality is that often that is because on good projects, there is a core idea there. And that core idea is the thing that our ideas are being channeled towards. And everything is kind of in service of maybe a couple of these ideas that are important. And so often what we get told to do is like decrease the volume or the impact on a lot of the things we need to make, so that the thing that is really clear or key about that particular project can stand out. And again, that often just feels to us like someone is cramping our style. And so when we try and do our own project, we often want to not have that restriction. But I think certainly from working as a concept artist on a huge variety of different projects and seeing so many different projects fail and so many succeed, this idea of having a clear vision of what that project is so important. It's often one of the reasons why you can have something that's got millions and millions of dollars worth of funding, it's got rooms full of people working on it, but still there's not a clear idea. People haven't really figured out what it is. We don't quite know. We're trying to figure it out. And if you don't, what naturally happens is it just kind of falls away into nothing, right? It has no being, right? It can't really justify its own existence. It has no unique selling proposition. People can't really explain it. And if you can't explain it there, it's probably hard for people to sell it and explain it in the marketplace. So I think that the more you kind of look into this, the more we understand that being able to set some guardrails for yourself creatively in your own brainstorming sessions is really critical. And that often our tendency is as artists, in the same way that if we look at the signal impact framework training, often our desire as artists is to experiment, right? On one day I'm doing plein air painting, another I'm going to do 3D modeling. Next I'm going to take up pottery, next I'm going to take up wood carving, and then I'm going to really just throw it all away and maybe become a fine artist and do a Jackson Pollock or some other kind of thing. We're often just inspired by that creativity, right? Like that's our superpower. We're good at coming up with ideas. We're good at going lateral. We're good at thinking of different things. But that's just one aspect of what you're going to need to create a really interesting project or a really interesting idea. And I just see so many artists coming up with these cool, interesting things. And often what I say, and I think this is the reason I kind of bring this up, is because we were sort of having a conversation about this in one of the communities that I sort of run. And this just really struck me as a critical idea that often we come up with a million cool ideas, but the thing that can often really connect back to that core idea often just gets skipped over. We often just don't go deeper. And I think one of the brainstorming techniques you can use is to just constrain and say, okay, out of all the worlds that you're creating, out of all the ideas you've got, how could you maybe forget about all the periphery, but just take one of those ideas that's really compelling? Like, what's the best, most interesting thing or something really unique about the world that you're building or the ideas that you're having? And if you just picked that and said, let's make a large part of the dramatic structure about this thing, about the way this particular science fiction universe functions, about the way that someone would feel within that world. Just pick one thing, one little aspect of it, and build everything around that. You will still be able to draw all the other stuff, create all the other stuff, but it's going to be secondary. A lot of it is just a matter of focusing and enhancing and bringing out and going deeper with a very specific, smaller aspect of your world. So if you have 100 monsters, just pick one. If you have 100 locations, just pick one. If you have a huge way that magic is meant to work in your world, just pick one real aspect of it that's small and interesting, and maybe build your entire story, your entire project around that one thing. If you have one small city, one small idea, that can often be far, far, far more powerful and interesting and be a much better foundation to build something on top of. And the reality is that often when you do, this is the irony, is when you do drill down, go much deeper with just one of those little aspects and really think about how that works, what it would be like for someone to engage with that, what that means to them and thus the rest of humanity and the way that we are going to live our lives going forward in the real world, it's often really easy then to add other stuff onto it. That's when you can add another million monsters, another million characters, another million cities, because it's all about that core idea and that core message that we've kind of drilled down to. And often what you find is then everything starts to rotate around that core idea. And yes, we have other places to explore other ideas that are important, but it's often one little element of magic, one little village, one little science fiction ship, or some other aspect of the world, of technology, of one technological advancement that we can really base everything around. And it's often that clarity that makes people understand how that story, project, game, animation, film, whatever, how that relates to them. Okay, let's do a couple of quick takeaways before we bounce out of here. Firstly, if we look at this from an analytical point of view, something I find really interesting here is just that as someone who creates things, we are really in the workshop. We are really looking at the mess of creation, the fire hose of creativity, a million different ideas, often that get thrown away in service of that one core interesting one. And I think this is just, there's often this tension I find here where we often, when we're working on our own personal projects, we kind of don't want to deal with the overhead of having to boil this idea down into something, because we just enjoy creating things and we enjoy the lateral movements, coming up with a million different ideas, throwing them away. And these things are very easy for us to come up with often. But the more you understand what other people are going to appreciate about our work is that they need something to hook onto so they can experience that world, so they can experience all of that creativity. If we go back to thinking about something like Star Wars, yes, there's a million aliens. Yes, there's a million spaceships. But the way that we experience that is with a very small number of aliens, a very small number of spaceships, a very personal story, something that is really focused, that you go deep on, and that relates to your experience as a consumer, as a viewer. And that really you're after something people can grab onto, can share, can understand, that will allow them to experience the rest of our creativity. It's just a fundamental way that we communicate ideas when you're working on the whole project yourself. And there's a big difference between working on a project by yourself and working on it as a cog in a machine, where you're often coming up with just one aspect of it, but we're kind of missing the bigger picture. If you want a really simple bro level way to think of this, it's that if you confuse, you lose. If we want to look at a practical takeaway here, this is actually really, really simple. Often we have a million cities, a million aliens, a million creatures, a million monsters, a million different fantasy races, and we're trying to just go wide. We're trying to come up with a million of these different things, a million different technological innovations, magical systems, whatever it is. But I think it's much better to build the muscle of picking one, pick the best one you can think of, and just understand that one thing could be all you do for the rest of your life. That you could build an entire project, an entire intellectual property, and this could be the one thing that you're known for, and you literally only need one. You just need one of these things that really works well and to go deep in it, and that could consume you for, as I said, literally the rest of your life. It could consume you for the next 5 or 10 years. You don't need a million ideas. You could probably, if you look at like great directors, like how many films have they made? How many ideas have they really had? Often not that many. You don't need that many. Like there's just not that much time in the world to create all that stuff. So I think once you kind of realize that, it really hopefully clarifies what the task at hand is to not necessarily come up with an infinity of stuff, but to just pick one that's pretty good and really go deeper and start to develop that idea. Really think about how would one of these ideas of magic within your world, one of these ways that technology is affecting the fabric of your society in a particular futuristic galaxy, how the different interactions between just one or two alien races would really create something interesting that would serve as a backdrop for an actual story. And just understand that, as I said, that may be all you need. for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years. You don't need all this other stuff. Yes, we'll create it, but the thing that's really going to anchor the story, that's going to be the hook, the X plus Y, that little equation, the elevator pitch, just needs to be one of those little elements, and that can often be the linchpin that holds everything together. And once you kind of understand that, hopefully it'll give you a completely different view of building your world. You only need one idea, max, again, over a fruitful long career, again, 5 or 10, and you'd probably be, one of these like amazing directors who's just been working on project after project after project. Again, so many times people are going to ask you to like do the sequel, do a follow-up, create that thing again. There's so many artists who have tried to write different fantasy books. They've tried to do something different and they just come back and they've been working on the same thing for like 20 years, right? Like that's all they can do. So often you only need one. If we look at this from a philosophical or spiritual point of view, I think one of the interesting things that I find here, and often the crux of our tension with these concepts, is that frequently building a lot of interest around a project is aligned with advertising and marketing and building a big audience and kind of the money, the capitalistic sort of side of it. And I think as artists, because that often doesn't serve us that well, and often you can kind of run up against that attitude poorly, where maybe you're working with other people and because something's going to make more money or less money, you kind of can or can't do some creative decision. We often get constrained by the realities of that commercialization of our art. I think because of that, though, we're often sleeping on the power here of really leaning into creating a lot of drama and coming up with high concept ideas and creating these kind of pitch-worthy things that it feels like that, coming up with an elevator pitch is not for people who are just working on their own personal passion project. That's for people who are trying to pitch stuff to Hollywood. But in reality, these things are all aligned. They're all the same, because creating something with a lot of power and meaning, where you're able to, as I said, like George Lucas did, really change the way that people view technology and their role in a futuristic environment with that technology. That in order to do that, you are probably going to need to get people interested. That your book, your blurb, your story, your pitch, your elevator pitch, whatever it is going to have to be interesting, right? It's going to have to be something where people are like, wait, what? I want to read that. I want to look at that thing. Let me see that, right? I want to go there. And that this aspirational nature of the pitch and the project and the proposition is just a fundamental part of how you're going to engage people. And yes, it's used for these kind of more mundane capitalistic transactions, and people do use it in these kind of, mundane sort of corporate ways, but that this is fundamentally a skill that we should own as artists. And it's often where a lot of the power is. And I think we're probably actually pretty good at it, at really understanding how to build those connections. And that I think if we just dive into that a little bit more and own it more as artists and just sort of treat it as part of the creative process, stop trying to run from it, I think that we can empower ourselves a huge amount. And again, my sort of dream here is that you could easily see a lot more really strong personal work created by people. But I think the process to actually get things commercialized does seem to be this sort of series of gatekeepers and this kind of going to see the oracle, going to get people to give you money, going to get permission. And if you just kind of flip a lot of those techniques and ideas of marketing and business and branding and coming up with a strong intellectual property and what that actually means and how to connect with people and being able to communicate what your story or your idea is about very clearly, if we kind of own that stuff as artists and really take it on board and work with it initially, I think you're going to find you're going to have a much better alignment. Again, let me know in the comments down below, between those commercial interests that we often have to fight with anyway, and also the audience, which is ultimately, I think, why we're here in the first place. Anyway, that's all we have got time for in this particular episode. Let me know in the comments down below or send me an email, tim@thedrawingcodex.com, how this one landed, whether it has helped you to think through some of the ideas that you have been developing for your own projects, whatever they may be. This is just a thought, but the more that I get closer to talking to people who are developing their own projects, the more that I've done this myself, the more that I've begun to understand that these concepts of branding and marketing and the pitch and how easy it is for us to communicate what our thing is are often at the core of us being able to get them happening, to get them off the ground. And I think that it's often an element of the process that feels as if it's kind of not our job as artists, right? It feels like that's for other people to deal with because they often do. And yet, I think if we can understand how to combine these, there's a lot of possibilities that open up. So these are things that I've been thinking about on my own, talking to people who are developing their own projects more and more. So I thought I'd bring this idea to you. But yeah, other than that, we'll catch you around on the next one.